And we can just, Robert, you can just take it away.
One thing I'm being told there's layers that can't read the screen.
Yeah, we might have to send them the PowerPoint slides later. We'll talk about what they are. Okay, sorry.
Thank you, everybody, for your patience and grace as we work through some technical issues here, but we are ready to go, and it is my pleasure to be here. I'm Robert Taylor. I'm the Portland City Attorney. I want to thank Jeff Selby and Judith Mowry from Portland's Office of Equity and Human Rights, and also Anika Ben Albert, Samantha Gamboa, Kathleen Simpson, and Tony Garcia from my office for their help in coordinating this event. I also want to thank the Metro Attorney's Office. I see Carrie here, and also the Multnomah County Attorney's Office for joining us, whether you're in person here with us or online. It is a real pleasure to be in the company of so many public service-minded legal professionals. It feels like home to be with you here, whether you're here in person or watching from somewhere else. And into this community today, we will be welcoming Professor John Powell. And I hope you make him feel just like he's at home too. Jeff Selby, the city's interim director of the Office of Equity and Human Rights, will be introducing Professor Powell, but I wanted to share just briefly that I have had the honor of hearing Professor Powell speak once before. And I was struck by his kindness and his intelligence and his thoughtfulness. Professor Powell is the kind of person who thinks deeply, and he also thinks differently. And he has that rare ability to truly help his audience to think deeply and to think differently. And I look forward to doing that with you all today with Professor Powell's help. It's my pleasure now to introduce Jeff Selby, the city's interim director for the Office of Equity and Human Rights. Jeff is an outstanding public servant. He has dedicated his career to advancing equity in the city. I know him to be honest, compassionate, and courageous. And he has been all of those things with me. Jeff, the city is lucky to have you. Please take it away.
Wow, thank you so much. I appreciate that. My name is Jeff Selby. My pronouns are he, him. It's an honor to be here today. John A. Powell, an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. He is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, a body that brings together scholars, community advocates, communicators, and policymakers to identify and eliminate the barriers to an inclusive, just, and sustainable society, and to create transformative change toward a more equitable world. Professor Powell's concept of targeted universalism is the foundation for the Office of Equity and Human Rights approach to institutionalizing racial equity work at the City of Portland. His words and his work help myriad equity practitioners around the world inspire themselves, and he has had a profound impact on my team at the Office of Equity and me personally. I want to thank Judith Mowry from my team who helped set all this up today. I also want to thank Grace Labrador Hallett, who does all the work behind the scenes to get us help as well. And also Yolanda Sanchez, our training manager at the Office of Equity, for being here today. The work you're all doing has so many vital implications for community and staff, and we appreciate your work as our legal guides. So with that, it is my absolute honor to introduce Professor John A. Powell.
Thank you, Jeff, Robert. It's always nice to be here. I'm taking the mask off, even when it's raining, maybe especially when it's raining. So let me tell you a little bit more about myself. And then this is really a presentation done by me and my director of research, Stephen in India. Stephen is on the phone, on the Zoom, so he'll join. So it's really two different presentations, although they complement each other. So I'm going to talk a little bit about targeted universalism. Stephen's going to sort of look at some of the issues in the law. We do a lot of work. We worked with folks here in the Portland area, in Seattle, around the country. And I always say, we value the work. We think it's really important. But you actually do the work. We sort of, if we didn't have partnerships with you, it would be just another academic exercise, which is not how I want to live my life. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself, and then part of this to credential myself, because I know, these are tricky times and treacherous times. People are sort of looking to go after you. If you even use the word equity, they're coming for you. So it could easily make someone turn into a turtle, be very timid. It's like, well, maybe if we hide, nothing bad will happen. And stuff bad's happening all the time. And my assessment of what you're doing is not to stop bad things from happening, but to make good things happen. But to do it in a smart way. So hopefully we can add to that effort today. So what Jeff didn't share with you, which many of you may know, I spent about 10 years as the National Legal Director of ACLU. So I've had a number of challenges in my tenure there and beyond. And so we think about, given where the law is and even where it's going, what is a good law practice, public interest law practice. Also, I'm co-founder of GARE. And about 6 years ago now, 5-6 years ago. And we started with 2 programs, one in Portland, one in Seattle. That was it. And I hired Julie Nelson as the director. And she had just gotten fired from her job in Seattle for doing good work. And I'm not just saying that. The Seattle Times said that. It's like, what? This doesn't make any sense. This woman's doing great work. Why is she getting fired? And the real reason was she'd actually pushed through family leave in Seattle. And a lot of the businesses were pissed. And they'd given heavily to the incoming mayor, and they wanted payback. And part of the payback was Julie has to go. And they had this big celebration or acknowledgement of Julie. And there were people, she'd been there, I think, like 19 years. There were people who were talking about how she helped her kids, got the kids out of prison, helped her get them a job, helped get a house, and from all walks of life, every race, ethnicity, Native Americans, white people, Asian, everybody. And they were just singing Julie's praises. And I gave the closing address. Having worked with Julie, I appreciated everything people said, but also said, this woman is now unemployed with a house note in Seattle. We have to take care of each other. Who's going to help her pay her house note? it's great. She's all done all this work for everybody, but now what? And I said, I'll make a commitment that I will do my part. And Julie and I talked shortly thereafter. And I said, look, you know what you're doing here in Seattle and what they're doing in Portland is great. It should be national. Why don't we take it on the road? And I don't have any money. I know you have a house note, but I raise money. I'm pretty good at that. And I said, if you want to take a chance, we'll do it. And she said, I think I want to take a chance. And in the midst of that, someone came who did have money and said, Julie, you know, you have money, you can have your pension, you can have, you know, security, you have insurance. You just wouldn't be doing equity work. And she came in and she said, what should I do? And I said, you have to decide that. You're putting your livelihood on the line. I do believe I can raise money, but I can't guarantee it. She decided to go with equity work. And as they say, the rest is history. Now there are over 400 government units, part of GARE. Julie supervises the staff, I think about 15 people, and it continues to grow. And I know Kathy Albiso yesterday, and she said, can't keep up with the demand. The work is going too fast. And so it was in need, and it was one of those potentially happy moments, although I guess happy middle because we're not at the end. As that you probably heard this, that someone says things will work out in the end. And if they haven't worked out, it's because it's not the end. So I'm going to be talking to you about target universalism, and Stephen's going to be talking more about the application of law. And one of the cases we're going to reference, and I'm just going to make a passing glance at it, is Parents Involved, which was a case out of Seattle and Louisville. And Kennedy really had the deciding vote. He wrote a concurring opinion. And he really set, in some ways, the framework. In addition to that, Justice Breyer, as you know, is stepping down, cited our brief. He writes a number of amicus briefs and others extensively, sort of embracing that frame. And I'm pleased to say, in another case where we talked about disparate impact, is that appropriate and constitutional in the court's current jurisprudence? And Stephen wanted to write an amicus brief in that case. And I said, given what a court is, it's a waste of time. But if you really want to do it, go ahead. And again, I was wrong. The court did, and Kennedy's one of his last opinions, Texas case, not only upheld disparate impact under Title 8, but again, he heavily cited our brief. And so sometimes surprisingly good things happen. So today I'm going to be talking about targeted universalism. I can't see those who are online, but for those who are here, how many of you, I know Jeff does, but how many of you actually know the concept targeted universalism? Show your hands. Okay, about half of you. Okay, so I'm going to give a little introduction and just try to get you grounded in there and turn it over to Stephen. So we have them.
You want the slides?
Yeah, the slides.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Some people said they were having trouble hearing me, John, so just trying to see.
Maybe I should pick this up. It's like calm it down. So go to the second slide when you have a chance. And there.
Yes, I'll get there as soon as I can. Where's the share?
And let me just say, while Judith is doing this, first of all, it's great to see Judith. And sorry to be putting up to work. Targeted universalism is very similar, but very distinct from equity. And what I'm going to posit today is that it's a subtle but significant difference. And that difference is not only important in terms of supporting the community, in terms of how you think about program, but also very important to sort of puts you in a much more in a safer path than a traditional approach to equity. There's some pushback. I'll be honest with you. Some people say, is that taking race off the table? Is that backing away? And the answer is no. But it approaches the question of race and other protected groups differently. And I think from both a moral perspective, from a communication perspective in terms of the larger community and a legal perspective, it puts you on much safer ground. So that's the gist of my talk today. So it's important to know what this is, and if you're doing it, or if you want to do it, and it resonates with you, and you want us to come back and help you think this through, because to state it is not that difficult, but to practice it there's a lot of nuances, and you can't cover it all in the next few minutes. Are we up now?
I think we're up.
Okay, so target universalism and the law. So the second slide should be overview. So one of the things we'll be talking about, obviously, is target universalism. Another is situatedness and structural analysis. So in some ways, you can say the heart of target universalism is a situatedness and structural analysis. And we'll make our slides available, so don't worry about taking notes. Target universalism is very distinct from a disparity framework. And I would say that the equity framework, as is used, is almost entirely practiced through a disparities framework. And that creates a lot of problems. In order to actually really think about target universalism and practice it, you have to really rely a lot on data, disaggregated data. The data helps you know how your different groups are situated. And then it's not just an operational strategy, it's also a communication strategy. It helps you talk about this problem in a way that doesn't create polarization and fracturing. Next slide. So what is target universalism, what we like to call TU? In some ways, TU is equity 2.0. And the 2.0 is quite a bit different than the 1.0. The 2.0, so what is it? First of all, think about equity. Equity oftentimes focus on a gap between two groups, an apparently favored group and a margin group. And then all the work becomes to try to remediate that disparity. So the goal then is to close the disparity. That's not the goal of TU. The primary goal of TU is to get everyone, we mean everyone, to a universal goal. So we have to start off by developing that goal. And there's a whole process of doing that. We talk about this in the context of belonging. Belonging, which is inclusion 2.0, with the major difference being belonging is predicated on co-creation. The people get to participate in the very thing they're joining. They don't come in as a guest. That's a big, again, sound like a small difference. Some of the people who are wanting to take our country back to some place that never was, but they wish it was, will say, Simon Huntington, for example, who wrote The Class of Civilization, he wrote a recent book called Who Are We? Which I would strongly recommend to not buy. But the gist of it, he says, we should stop saying we're immigrant country. We're a settler country. And he says, what a settler country means is that the original settlers set the template, they set the rules, they set the norm, they set the culture. And everybody else comes as a guest. And if they don't follow the rules, we should not be shy of asking them to leave. So that's a version of inclusion. You're included, but you're included as a guest. Don't start messing with the furniture. Don't start changing the food or the music. And as long as you behave, whatever that means, you're more or less welcome as a guest. So that's how we think inclusion is practiced. You go join a company and they say, great to have you. You know, you're our first woman lawyer. But we have this culture that we've developed over the last 70 years, and I'm sure you'll adapt. As opposed to, what do you bring in terms of your full self? Not just your talents, but your full self. So inclusion is not always inviting the full self, and it's not always inviting the co-creation. Belonging, that's the heart of belonging. It's that people get to co-create the very thing they belong. So you state a universal goal. The universal goal is done through a process of co-creation. And then you identify where groups are in relationship to the goal. And then and I'll say more about this in a little bit, then you try to understand their situatedness. how are they situated within the structure and cultures that we're concerned about? And again, the data helps you a lot with that. And then you develop targeted strategies to get each group to that universal goal. Now, I gave a talk yesterday to a very large foundation that I won't name, but let's just say it's up north. And they've adopted target universalism. But here's the rub. They say, so we have a universal goal, and then we target certain groups to get them to that goal. I said, great, but no cigar. That's not target universalism. You're not targeting groups. You're targeting strategies. The strategies are what target. Every group is targeted. So you're not picking one group over another group. You're just saying groups are situated differently. So some groups may get more or get something different than another group, but it doesn't mean the other group is not also targeted. So every group is targeted. And the goal is to get every group to that universal, which means understanding how they're situated. That's the heart of target universalism. And there's a lot in there. Next slide. So the situatedness, how do you decide what matters in terms of situatedness? Well, again, part of that's logical, reasonable, but also part of it is in conversation with other people. What's significant? And so again, you don't use a single indicator, which we often do. It's like socioeconomic status. We're going to use that as the indicator to see how groups are situated. And we assert, along with other researchers, that that's radically inadequate. You need a range of things, because what you're really trying to do is capture and understand what actually enhance or inhibits people's life opportunity. It's not just SES. We'll talk more about that. We do something called opportunity mapping, which have been upheld in federal court by moderate Republicans, judges. Excuse me. And we use anywhere from 14 to 30 plus indicators. Some have actually used as many as 100 different indicators. But all this taking, what are the indicators that actually are important in terms of affecting our life opportunity and flourishing? Next slide. So the concept of equality is a relatively new concept. I was listening this morning to Thomas Piketty's new book, A Brief History of Equality. And I think I would recommend it. I've been in the process in my head of writing an article on the history of equality. And then I found out about 2 weeks ago that Piketty had written a book on the history of equality. But my article is still in need. Because Piketty, what he does, which is interesting, I think most of you know he's a French economist who's quite the rave. Some people say he's the most important economist since Adam Smith. But in any case, he starts his history in the 18th century. He starts his history with the United States and France. And there's a logic to that. Equality was not a salient concept in our society, in the world, until the United States and France. It's an amazing thing. So it's really a new political concept. Next slide. In fact, the assumption was that things were quite unequal. Here's some laws, some old laws, which it basically says you treat people differently because they're people like different status. So there's slave codes, and there's codes for people who are not slaves. There were codes for people who were noble. They were treated completely differently, and no one questioned the validity of that. That was just given. Next slide. So I like to deliberately put this in. So I said it's a relatively new idea. But here's the old origin, at least for Western civilization, for much of the way we think about equality. And the history is actually quite important. It's quite interesting because a lot of people credit me with targeting universalism. I'm one of the first people who use the concept in the way I use it. But I like to give credit where credit is due. And so I want to cite someone who taught me about targeting universalism. And it was Aristotle. That's useful because some people, it's like this new stuff. this old black guy from Berkeley is trying to push something down my throat. Next thing you know, he's going to be citing Marx. So Aristotle, a lot of people feel comfortable with Aristotle, even though nobody reads him anymore. One of the things Aristotle said is that societies can be unequal, but the ratio should never be more than 4 or 5 to 1, meaning that your boss may make more money than you, but it shouldn't be more than 4 or 5 times as much as you make. So take that, Elon Musk. But anyway, the point is that Aristotle thought deeply about society, about democracy, and about equality. And his thoughts about equality has informed the French and Thomas Jefferson. So what do we have to say about equality? And like any important concept, equality has a history. There's not a single meaning. So Aristotle talked about 2 different kinds of equality. He talked about arithmetic equality, and he talked about geometric equality. Arithmetic equality is where he says, when people are situated the same, equality and fairness requires they're treated the same. Seems pretty straightforward. But he went on to say, when people, equality and fairness requires, when people are situated differently, that they're treated differently. Now, the first part of that, arithmetic part, is something that we embrace strongly in the United States. In fact, fairly recently, the whole thing was, I treat everybody the same. I'm an Aristotelian. No, they would say that. But in a sense, that's where it comes from. But they forget the second part of what Aristotle said, is that when people are situated differently, you treat them differently. The situatedness matters a lot. And so, at some point, we're fighting about what equality means. Equality of opportunity, equality of results. This big fight. This is all, in a sense, riffing off of Aristotle without knowing it. And so equity, in a sense, was an effort to recapture Aristotle's second part of equality. It's basically saying not all groups are situated the same. So think about schools. Should school funding be the same for all schools? And eventually, the federal government said no. Some schools had greater need and therefore had greater funding. Title II funding. First, it was very controversial, and now it's not so controversial, or maybe it's becoming controversial again. But part of it is in understanding what equality means. And what better source than to go back to Aristotle? My phone keeps cutting off.
Next slide.
Next slide. So this is just a schematic of the history we made. So that again, far right, far left, equality is not even a concept. People don't think, it's like they're noble, they're kings and queens, they're serfs, they're slaves, they're women, and it's just accepted that people have a different station in life and that they're born that way and they'll die that way. Nothing controversial about it. So when Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, and he said all men were created equal, some people said, well, he said men, but he really meant people. He did not mean people. He meant men. And if you have any doubt, it took us until 1920 to say, okay, women, maybe they should have the right to vote. So Jefferson's idea of equality was very cramped in a way. He did not mean everybody. And some people say, he was a hypocrite. He had 200 slaves and told all men are created. He didn't think of the enslaved people, particularly blacks, as people. Even though he liked one of them. He still didn't think of them as a group, as people. So to him, that was not a contradiction. His idea of equality is that equality was between a small group of men. And the person who changed that in terms of our national lexicon was Lincoln. Very conscious. Lincoln was a student of Enlightenment, of the Greeks as well, in Enlightenment. And he said, no, let's have a new birth of freedom. He was calling for a new way of thinking about equality. And in a sense, he was the progenitor of the 14th Amendment. And so his idea was not that it was just to men, but it should be, first of all, everyone, and also a living concept. And so we're still on the journey. And so at one point we moved to equality, treat everybody the same, then to equity. And I'm suggesting the next move is targeted universalism. Next slide. Now, if you look at the slide, one of the things that's important about it, first of all, go back one, Judith. I'll say more about this, but if you look at the slide with the three people trying to look over the fence, the idea is that they need some assistance to look over the fence because they're situated differently. We'll come back to that. Now, the next slide. If you look on the left-hand part of the slide, you see the effort is to get the green person, or that one person, to the universal goal. That's equity. So we pick a group and you say, let's actually help this group close the disparities and get to this goal. What's the goal? The goal is what some other group, which we consider a more favored group, has. So it's oftentimes like the assumption is white men is the gold standard. So we can say, we want to close the gap between white men and Black women, whatever. There's a lot of problems with that. I can go into it later if you want. But target universalism, the goal is to get every group to that universal. Now notice, if every group gets to that universal, there's also no more disparities. So you'd actually close the disparities. But the measurement of those disparities in large measure is the universal goal itself. Next slide. So you have to, this is just the way you do it. You articulate the goal, you look at the difference, you look at geography and other things that actually create a diversion from the goal. You assess barriers to achieving the goal, and then you craft targeted processes so that each group can reach that universal goal. Next slide. Here, and I'll give you all this, but here there's examples of this happening all across the country. So Baltimore, they found that Black kids in Baltimore were not doing well, in part because they couldn't see and they didn't have glasses. And so one strategy was, let's buy glasses for Black kids in Baltimore. That's not what they did. They actually started testing all the kids and giving glasses, free glasses, to any kid who needed glasses. The universal goal, one of them, be able to see when you're in school. And it was, the beneficiaries of it was probably 80% of the students who participated, over 80% were Black students. It was not at all controversial, right? The universal goal, and then strategy based on each person's situatedness. Sacramento, there was a situation there where kids were, infants were being killed essentially by their mothers. They were sleeping in the same bed, the mothers would roll over at night and suffocate. They found that the difference between the Black community and white community in terms of that tragedy was 5 to 1, 5 times more likely to happen if you're Black than if you're white. Between Latinos and whites, it was 3 to 1, 3 times more likely to happen if you're Latino than if you're white. The Sacramento Foundation came to me because we were doing work around target universalism, and they said, we don't have enough money to do everything. So some people said we should just focus on the Black kids because they are by far hurting the most as a result of this, for a whole bunch of reasons. What do you think? It's your money, you decide. What I think is you should do target universalism. And you might weight it. You might say more money, more. There's not just money, there's also cultural things. We'll go to the Black community. But you actually want to communicate that you care about all kids, that you aren't picking winners and losers. And there's a big controversy. They ultimately settled on that. They created a weighted program. And again, it's a happy ending. Money poured in. Once people saw that all the kids were being considered, they eventually had more than enough money to actually provide a program that actually affected all the kids in the Sacramento area. That won't always be the case, but it shows that just sort of the resonance in terms of doing a program where you express care for everyone without saying everyone's the same. Everyone's situated the same, because they're not. Next slide. This is just looking at equality versus equity versus target universalism. First of all, let me just call your attention to the people on boxes. This was going around internet for a while. It may still be. But the problem with this is that it ends up focusing on the people. And so it's like, okay, some people are not doing well. What's wrong with them? How do we fix them? And as you can see, target universalism focus more on structures than on individuals. Equity oftentimes focus on individuals. And again, equity oftentimes focus on disparities. And so it, in a sense, is creating competition between groups, saying, my group deserves something, and maybe your group is neutral, or maybe your group caused the problem. But in that formulation, your group, if you're not one of the marginal groups that's identified, it's not getting anything out of it. And at worst, you might be getting something negative out of it. Next slide. So target universalism is an equity policy framework. It's not a policy itself. It applies to virtually every policy you're looking at. It's a framework in how you think about policies. And it's designed to help you achieve those universal goals. Next slide. Stephen will talk more about this. So you can have race-specific policies, and you can have universalistic policies that are race-conscious. So you can have policies that are sensitive to race, but not necessarily specifically name race, or you can have policies that specifically name race. You have policies that specifically name race, that's more likely to be a targeted policy. You have policies that are sensitive to race, like the glasses in Baltimore. It doesn't necessarily name race, or may name it in a certain way, but it's really, the goal is universal. Next slide. And we talked already about the importance of data and situatedness in culture. Next slide. So this is something that's intuitive, but I want to state it, that we all live in structures. And structures are not neutral. Structures are doing some work. And that actually, if we accept that, that suggests a number of things. That suggests that we affirmatively do have structures do the work we want them to do. We don't have to find a perpetrator. We look at the structures themselves. And importantly, we look at the outcomes. So targeted universalism is outcome-oriented, not process-oriented, not inputs-oriented. What happens at the end of the day? Next slide. Again, that's a correction of the earlier slide where you saw the people being different heights. In the far right now, you see all the people being the same height. And what's the difference about them is the structures that they are actually engaging with. And so you want to pay attention to those structures. Next slide. There's another variation of that. So we oftentimes don't think of structures as being, we think of structures as being neutral. And so when you see an escalator, you don't think about how that's burdening someone in a wheelchair. In fact, we may not even notice that until someone in a wheelchair shows up. When that happens, we're likely to talk about the person in the wheelchair having special needs. I don't even like that phrase. All of us have special needs. But if we're part of the dominant majority, those special needs are not considered special, it's just the norm. Next slide. This is one of my favorite. Think about luggage racks. So seems like a neutral phenomenon. Luggage racks on airplanes. What's the deal? They're overhead. There's a certain population in the country that's shorter than on the average than the other population. Of course, we're talking about women. Women have less upper body strength. And on average, women carry more luggage. Now, this is a structural problem. And interestingly enough, women are the majority. So this design was not designed for the majority, it was designed for another group, in mind. So what do women do in this situation? Well, here's what a lot of women do. They actually check their luggage. But think about that. Checking your luggage, you have to be at the airport anywhere from half an hour to an hour earlier to check your luggage. And when you get off the plane, It takes another half an hour to get your luggage. And way too often, your luggage doesn't get there at all. So here what we have, and this is typical, we have an individual intervention for a structural problem, and it doesn't work well. So we have these workarounds. We leave the structure in place and we leave it up to the individual to figure out how to work around the structure. Next slide. So when we see this, we say we should remove barriers. But I'm suggesting something else. I'm suggesting that we affirmatively design structures to produce the outcome for all the groups we want to happen. We affirmatively design structure. So we don't build a building and then here comes the guy in a wheelchair and we say, oh, we forgot. We need to add on a ramp. When we do that, the ramp is not in a good place, it's wonky because it wasn't in the original design. So affirmatively design the structure so it's doing the work we want to do. Next slide. So target universalism, this is all expressions of target universalism. It moves us from exclusion to inclusion and beyond. Next slide. And ultimately, it moves us to belonging. Next slide. So it takes us beyond the disparity framework. Next slide. And it puts everyone in the driver's seat. Next slide. So again, how is this different in equity? The way we practice equity is that we pick one group and we're going to close the gap with that group. And that practice is likely to create what we call breaking, fighting between groups. And competition, like who is the most marginal group? Because the most marginal group is the one that will apparently garner attention. And then, next slide, we also have to figure out how to communicate it. How do I explain to you? And I've worked with schools and they say, we have a program to help African-American Black boys. The Latinos show up and say, what about us? And you have to explain it to them. Well, let me tell you about the history of Black boys. Let me tell you how they're doing in school. I said, well, what about my history? What about how I'm doing? That doesn't count. So it's actually a hard thing to actually justify. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephen before I do 2 quick comments. Situatedness, if done right, is doing a lot of work. Now, interesting, everybody's situated, but we just situated differently. And situatedness is actually not just data, it's also telling our story. But it's also telling our story not in a categorical way that my story counts and your story does not count. And what Stephen's going to focus on is some legal examples. And just before I hand it over, the obvious thing, when you go back to Kennedy and others in terms of, they're saying, can a practice be race conscious without triggering strict scrutiny? And Kennedy says, yes, it certainly can be race conscious. He says you don't have to be shy about it. So you can, and Robert Sampson at Harvard said using 6 different indicators, you can actually target the urban Black community with 6 different indicators. We use 14 or 30. So you can have the indicators do a lot of work. You can cook the books legitimately. But what I'm suggesting is not just cooking the books to just focus on Blacks, but say, there's something going on here. We can fix it. The most stable, by many counts, affirmative action plan in the country is the Texas 10% plan. Texas is not a liberal state. That case has been to the Supreme Court at least 3 times, maybe 4, and it's survived. It's been put vote in Texas more than once, and it survived. How is that happening? It survived because it's actually an affirmative action plan for Blacks, for Latinos, and for rural whites. That creates a really powerful coalition. It also creates a pretty nice narrative. It also creates opportunity. It's hard to imagine a plan. I live in California. We don't have affirmative action in California. We're supposed to be a much more liberal state. But we haven't been strategic in terms of thinking about affirmative action. And we get beat up on, and they say, what about this group? And we say, it's not their turn. We'll get to them later. And it exposes us to legal challenges, but it also exposes us to challenges in the larger public discourse. And they just had a vote in California on affirmative action, which was fairly limited in terms of focusing on Blacks and Latinos. And in this liberal state where a lot of progressive laws passed, it was handily defeated. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen and look forward to the question and answer later.
Remote panels. I apologize, everyone, for all of the technical issues. This is really not my thing. Stephen, I've made you, there we go. Apparently the slides were not moving for the folks who are watching on Zoom, and so we will be sharing those. I think John covered everything that was important about it. Hi, Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you. A couple housekeeping items before I get started.
I can't hear Stephen.
I can hear you.
Okay, so other people can hear him. We can't hear him.
It sounds like the folks in the stream can hear me. I also need the ability to turn on my video.
The receiver.
They say you just sent a text also saying you need to make him co-host so you can present.
I did. I made him a presenter.
It's just the audio is the problem.
Yeah. So, do you want?
This Nathan?
Okay.
I will go ahead and start sharing my slides.
Yeah, I mean, the joke I make all the time is that excitement is guaranteed. Success is not guaranteed, but excitement certainly is.
What's this on your timeline?
Stephen, we can hear you now.
You've slightly
Okay.
put back the expected date.
Hi, John. Glad to be with you all.
So, Stephen,
Yes.
Stephen, we can hear you and a
Okay,
lot of other people at the same time.
Yeah, I can hear, it sounds like a television set in the background. So, okay, I think someone just muted, so I'm ready to proceed. Can you also see my slides? I've got the slides open. It looks like people in the chat are able to see the slides. Great. I don't know if people in the room can see the slides, so I'll just go ahead in the interest of time and get started. Well, first of all, thank you to the city and John having me step in and present to complement John's talk on. I'm going to talk about race-conscious policymaking, and John did a great job outlining the impetus and the components of targeted universalism. So I've called this portion race-conscious policymaking do's and don'ts. It's a little it's a little casual, but I think you'll see and appreciate the framing in a moment. But this is several parts. Let me just move forward. Just to get everyone on the same page, let's just start with some terms and key ideas, because we have conversations around race-conscious policymaking, whether we call it race-based or race-neutral or universal or targeted. There can be a lot of confusion in terms of what people actually mean when they're using these terms. So let me just step back and start with the notion of a race-conscious policy as an overview. So basically, let me just see if I can move this bar. There we go. Race-conscious policies, as John alluded to, are policies that are not just designed with a racial sensitivity, but they're either designed with an explicit racial purpose or goal, or a conscious awareness of their racial effects. It could be a disparate impact, or it could be something that's far more deliberate and intentional. And because this category is so big, there are an enormous number of policies that could fall under this header. I'm going to talk about a few of these in just a moment. So race-conscious policies encompass policies that are race-targeted, or those that are race-specific, and I'll talk about what that means. It also encompasses a large swath of universalistic policies, which is really counterintuitive. It can also cover class-based policies, again, if they have a racial purpose, geographically based policies, and actually many other policies besides. So let me review some of those briefly, and then I'll get to the meat and potatoes of the presentation. When you think about race-specific or race-targeted policies, what we're really talking about are policies that have either by design an explicit, superficial, on the face of it racial component, or they extend benefits or protections to a particular racial group. So for example, if you were to design and implement a reparations policy that was specifically aimed at alleviating the enduring harmful effects of American slavery, and the mechanism for that policy was a cash payment or targeted benefits solely to descendants of enslaved African Americans, that would be considered a race-specific or race-targeted policy. Now note that the descendants of American slaves is only a portion of all African Americans, right? Because there are many African Americans who are descendants of Caribbean immigrants or African immigrants who were not actually descended from American slaves. So not all Black Americans would benefit. Nonetheless, it would be a race-targeted or race-specific policy. And that's what I mentioned right there. So not everyone who is Black in America would receive a benefit under this policy, but non-Black persons would generally be categorically excluded. Another example of a race-targeted or race-specific policy would be a municipal contracting or procurement set-aside policy. These used to be common in the 80s and 90s. They're less common today, although different variants of these exist. These policies typically set aside a certain portion of dollars or portion of contracts for minority business owners. And to the extent that such policies depend upon the racial identity of the business owner, these are considered race-specific or race-targeted. Now contrast those with universalistic policies. And notice I have in brackets here, universalistic race-conscious policies. So universalistic race-conscious policies are those that extend benefits or protections to everyone or nearly everyone, but and are not delimited or restricted based upon the racial identity of the recipients or the intended beneficiaries. Nonetheless, they're race-conscious because they're designed in a way in which the promoters of the policy have reason to believe that the policy will tackle a racial problem or reduce racial disparities. So for example, I'll give you a couple examples. The 24th Amendment is a constitutional amendment that abolishes the poll tax. The framers of that amendment were targeting a trenchant problem in the South, which was the use of poll taxes to make it harder for Black Americans in the South to vote. So this was targeted at a race-specific problem. But the ultimate amendment, as it was adopted, was universalistic in its prohibition. It prohibits all poll taxes on all citizens as a condition of voting. As an alternative way of framing it, it could have just prohibited poll taxes on Black voters. It did not. So it's universalistic in its scope. Now, there are very few examples of truly universalistic policies. That's because most universalistic policies have some restriction built in. So think, for example, about universal suffrage. We call it universalistic suffrage because voting rights in the United States are not conditioned on race, on class, or on gender, thanks to a series of constitutional amendments. But we do tend to restrict voting rights on the basis of age. So there's actually a constitutional amendment that allows people who are 18 or older to vote. So it's not truly universalistic. There are, however, people who think that there should be voting rights extended to children by proxy to parents. And there are also people, myself included, who think that in municipal elections, in some circumstances, or even state elections, non-citizens should be able to vote. The United States has a long history of allowing non-citizens to vote. Most states in the 19th century actually allowed white non-citizens to vote in municipal and state elections. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now, but universal suffrage in the United States is not actually truly universal because it's usually as a citizenship requirement and an age requirement. Nonetheless, the idea of universal is that it extends to a broad range of people. Another example of a race-conscious but not race-specific policy would be bail reform. So bail reforms generally come out of a recognition of the disparate impacts in the criminal justice system on people of color, particularly the abuse and use of cash bail. And so bail reform policies typically, again, don't say, one set of policies for bail for people of color and one for white people. They're universally applied. And there are other policies here I mentioned that are race conscious, but universalistic in their design, including the Texas 10% plan, which John mentioned at several points in his talk, right? The policy simply says, if you graduate in the top 10% of a public high school class in Texas, you qualify for automatic admission to UT Austin. So it's universalistic, but it's race conscious in that the purpose of the policy is to promote racial diversity at UT Austin. There are other ways to generate race conscious policies, such as on class or geography, that are not race targeted nor universalistic. So I'll give you another example. In her book, Whiteness of Wealth, Emory tax law professor Dorothy Brown recommends what she calls a reparation tax credit. But she recognizes that a tax credit that's race specific would be unlikely to survive judicial review. So she recommended that Congress adopt a refundable tax credit that would target Americans on the basis of wealth instead of race. So this is an example how, in some cases, promoters of race-conscious policies will sometimes use class instead of race as a proxy. Now, race and class are imperfect proxies. As John mentioned, the more factors you consider, the closer you can get to race. She did a calculation and found that if you were to implement her policy on the basis of wealth instead of race, 83% of Black households will qualify. So 83% is not the same as 100%, but it's a very high correlation from a statistical perspective. It's not a perfect correspondence, but it's close enough that it's a reasonable proxy. So in some cases, class is used as a reasonable proxy. Now, there is a deep literature on when to use race, when to use class. I'm not going to get into that. There are promoters of each approach. One of the readings that we had recommended that you read was our essay on the Structural Racism Remedies Repository, which has a summary and synopsis of that debate. So I'm not going to repeat that here, but I'll just flag and note it if you want to dive into that debate. I'm going to move forward. So as you can already see, there's a lot of nuance here, and this can lead to an enormous amount of confusion, particularly over the terms that are used. So race conscious can be confusing because it is primarily about ends, not means. That is to say, it's about goals, not the mechanism by which you reach the goal. So many race conscious policies do not use race as a means, only as an end. And for that reason, it can be difficult to tell whether a policy is race conscious or not. So I'll give you another example. In his campaign book, The Audacity of Hope, Barack Obama was talking about universal health care, which ultimately became, we call now, Obamacare. And he argued that a universal healthcare system would be very efficacious in reducing racial disparities. Does that make it race conscious? Well, it depends on the legislative intent, and it depends on what sort of evidence was used to design the system, right? It's just hard to know. In contrast, every race-specific or race-targeted policy is obviously race-conscious. So there's no debate about whether it's race-conscious or not. Similarly, there's a lot of confusion over the term race-based. Race-based is extremely ambiguous in most cases. It can refer similarly to policies that are simply race-conscious and that they have a racial purpose or an awareness that they'll have a race effect. But in the main, it refers to policies being race-specific or race-targeted, so that the policy is based on racial identity. So for example, the Biden administration last year attempted to provide non-white rural farmers with additional assistance from a $4 billion federal fund. This immediately got a lot of opposition from white farmers. And a lawsuit against the Biden administration was actually successful in federal court for reasons I'll get into in a moment. Finally, I think the most confusing term is the term race neutral. And Judith, in the correspondence preceding this talk, wanted John to talk about race neutrality and how you can implement policies that can reduce racial disparities in a race neutral way. But as the remarks I've given so far suggest, there's a lot of ambiguity in what is meant by race neutrality. So for example, is a policy race neutral if it's not race specific and has no racial effect, even though there may be a racial purpose? policies that are universalistic in form and do not use race in the design, but have a consistently racial disparate impact, like municipal land use policies or criminal background checks, right, the so-called ban the box, can hardly be characterized as race neutral. In fact, this is one of the criticisms of race neutrality, is that few policies are truly neutral. John talked about, for example, the airline policy about hoisting or stowing luggage, right? That's not gender neutral, although the people who designed planes maybe didn't think about that. So what does it mean to be race neutral? Race neutrality is a really problematic descriptor because it can connote that a policy is neutral in terms of its purpose, its face, its form, its operation, or its effect, without being clear about which is the intended meaning. So when someone's talking about race neutrality, they may simply be talking about the fact that a policy is race neutral on its face or its form, but they may not be talking about its effect or its purpose. And yet other people might be talking about purpose or effect, right? This generates a lot of confusion in which people are talking past each other. So I tend to avoid the use of the term race neutrality and tend to talk about either whether a policy or a program or a law is either race conscious or race targeted. Now, as lawyers, there's actually another term that we really have to pay closer attention. I'm going to move forward since we're running a little low on time. The key term is actually racial classification. So the United States Constitution under the 14th Amendment generally permits government officials to consider race in a wide variety of ways, unless there is a racial classification. And if there is a racial classification, then the policy, at least in federal court, is going to be reviewed under strict scrutiny, and the policy will be considered presumptively unconstitutional. So if a policy, an action, or a program is race conscious but does not employ racial classifications, then that policy will generally be reviewed under what's called rational basis review, with the presumption being that it's constitutional. So there's a bifurcation in constitutional analysis that really hinges heavily on whether a policy or program uses a racial classification. And that's because of the interpretation of the 14th Amendment, which generally has been interpreted to prohibit only intentional state-based discrimination and racial classifications. So what does that mean? What does that have to do with discrimination? Well, because the court has made it really difficult to prove intentional discrimination, and having a racial purpose is not the same thing as intentional discrimination, therefore there is a wide berth for race-conscious policies that do not employ racial classifications. So let me go through this a little bit, and I think you can hear me. I don't know if I'll be able to hear you, but let me just do a little bit of call and response, but just frame this really clearly. So racial classifications in law generally have 5 elements. I'm going to summarize them at the end, but here are the 4 critical ones. Racial classifications are policies or programs or actions. An action could be like, for example, a mayor or a governor or an admissions committee, if it's not, or for example, a warden in a jail or prison, if it's not a policy. Racial classifications have explicit or what is known as facial racial categories in the use of race. Second, they classify or label individuals on the basis of race. And then that classification is then the basis for promoting, admitting, or otherwise awarding a benefit or a resource. And it's a means to an end. Whereas, as the remarks I've given so far suggest, race consciousness may or may not have explicit racial categories in policy. It may or may not involve individuals. It could be done at the group level. And it may or may not involve awarding a benefit or imposing a burden. It may just be a universalistic policy that has certain effects, but it's not based on race in a particular way. And it could be a means or could be an end goal. So let me go through these and ask you 2 questions. Is the policy race conscious, and does it entail racial classifications? We'll test to see if I can hear you. Okay, so number 1, the state law requiring railway carriers to provide different cars for white and colored passengers. Is this policy race conscious? You can just type the answer in the chat, yes or no. One person has said yes. Anyone else want to jump in? Yes, this is clearly race conscious. It's explicit in targeting race, so we know it's race conscious. Does it entail racial classification? Does it require the railway carrier to label passengers on their race, by race? Yes, it does. So this is both race class conscious and has a racial classification. And this is,
does it entail racial classification?
if someone could mute, I can hear myself talking.
To label passengers on their race, by race.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it does. So this is both
I'm
race
getting
class
feedback.
conscious
If
and has
someone
racial
can mute.
classification. And this is does it entail racial classification?
If someone could mute, I can hear myself talking. Okay, I don't know if someone muted, but I'll just keep going. So, and that, by the way, that statute was the statute, the Louisiana Railway statute that was challenged in Plessy versus Ferguson. So second, a federal statute restricting naturalization to free white persons. Is this race conscious? If you could just put in the chat. Yes, this is race conscious. Obviously, the specific components of the law, are race specific and therefore race conscious. Does it entail racial classification? Does it require a naturalization or immigration officer to label a person, an applicant, an immigrant applicant's naturalization form by race? The answer is yes. This is the first United States Immigration and Naturalization Statute of 1793, which was signed by George Washington. Third, an administrative regulation tracking student performance by race. Would a school or a school board's administrative regulation, would this be race conscious? By design, it would be. Would this entail racial classification as I've laid it out? Now, there's some disagreement in the chat about whether this entails racial classification. So remember, racial classification in federal jurisprudence isn't just about whether people are labeled by government on the basis of race. It also requires that there be a benefit or burden imposed on the basis of that label and classification. Here, this is simply data tracking and monitoring. Therefore, this is not a racial classification as that term of art is used in federal law. A financial incentive for hiring minority employees. Is this race conscious? The chat is saying yes, this is very likely. If there's a financial incentive, that probably is race conscious. Does it entail racial classification? A little bit more difficult to answer, but the answer is probably yes, because the ultimate effect would be that it would benefit minority applicants or for the position and give them a slight advantage in the hiring process. So this would probably be considered a racial classification. A scholarship fund established for minority youth. Now it's a little bit complicated, but just suppose this is a state level fund. Let's say California established the fund. Would this be race conscious? Does it have a racial purpose? Yes. Does it entail racial classification? Well, if the applicants for the fund, right, are decided on a racial basis, then it is probably a racial classification. Now, there might be a nuance. Suppose the fund is supported by the state, but it was funded by private donors. There's actually an issue right now. I believe it's the city of Santa Monica, or some Southern California city is actually creating a fund for LGBTQ persons. There would be a sexual orientation classification entailed, but the funding is coming from a private source. So it's unclear whether the benefit, the commingling of state and private action here is a little bit complicated, but assuming this is a state-funded scholarship fund, this is both race conscious and would entail racial classification. A state-based set-aside program for minority businesses. I'm going to just move a little bit more quickly because I'm running out of time. This is probably race conscious, and again, would entail racial classifications. Now, think about this one. A program of city financing for small firms who cannot meet bonding or capital requirements. Is this race conscious? Yes or no? We don't actually have enough information to answer the question. After Adarand, this was a suggestion that comes out of actually Justice O'Connor's opinion in I can't remember if it's Croson or Adarand. It was the Richmond case, where she had suggested these were alternatives to a set-aside program for minority firms. So if you, for example, were to do a financing program for small firms, maybe disproportionately who might be minority-owned businesses, who because of the history of discrimination in city contracting does not actually have the capital to apply for some of these jobs, that could actually have a disparate effect. So it might be race conscious, but it certainly does not entail racial classification, because the classification here would be the size of the firm, not who owns the firm in terms of their race. Okay, so this is one we've talked about a lot. A state law mandating the admission to the top 10% of each high school graduating class to a state university, specifically the Texas 10% plan. Is this race conscious? The answer is yes. Does it entail racial classification? The answer is no. And the reason is because the classification is the junior to seniors class rank. So it's class rank, not race. Okay, you understand this is not a racial classification. And so John talked about Justice Kennedy's concurrence in parents involved. So in his concurrence, he said that it is in the administration of public schools by state and local authorities, it is permissible to consider the racial makeup of schools and to adopt general policies to encourage a diverse student body. However, and so how can they do that? Well, they can do it through a number of means. They can do it through strategic site selection of new schools, meaning that school boards can consider the geographic location of where they want to open a school. And that location can be drawn with an awareness of racial demographics in the community. So if you know, for example, that one census tract is predominantly white and another is predominantly non-white, then you can select the school site to create diversity in terms of its catchment zone. You can also draw attendance boundaries with a general recognition of demographics. You can allocate resources for special programs. You can recruit students and faculty in a targeted fashion and track enrollments, performance, and statistics by race. As he says, these mechanisms are race conscious, again, terminology that I prefer, but they do not lead to differential treatment based on classifications that tell each student that he or she is to be defined by race. So this is basically the safe harbor. You can use race conscious policies that do not entail racial classifications. As long as you're doing that, for the most part, the policy will be reviewed under rational basis review rather than strict scrutiny. So let me just wrap up here since I'm running out of time. So to summarize, I only think 2 slides left. Racial classifications basically have 5 elements. There's an official government label proclaiming or identifying the race of a particular individual, which is then the basis for allocating benefits or imposing burdens on the person classified. Now, there are sometimes exceptions to each of these elements, but there have been policies in almost every context that entail racial classifications in which federal courts have struck them down. So in Johnson versus California, the Supreme Court struck down a policy of segregating prisoners, incarcerated persons, on the basis of race because it was a racial classification. Generally speaking, racial classifications only exist when all 5 elements are present. Thus, self-identification, like the census, is not a government-based racial classification that will entail strict scrutiny review. So it's the presence of racial classification that is generally what is meant by government policy based on race. It's extremely difficult to survive strict scrutiny review. You need to have a compelling justification, right? You need to have, that's the first prong. And then for narrow tailoring, you have to exhaust race neutral alternatives and explain why they do not suffice. Now, there are policies that have survived strict scrutiny review. The most notable one in the United States Supreme Court is Fisher versus Texas, which was the University of Texas's race conscious policy that supplemented the Texas 10% plan. And in federal court, at least at the lower level, there's the Harvard policy and the University of North Carolina policy. Now, the bad news is those 2 policies are now going to be reviewed by the Supreme Court this fall. So it's unclear whether those very carefully designed policies that were very carefully designed using statistics, the exhaustion of race neutral alternatives, whether that will actually suffice. But as long as you're not using racial classifications, you're generally going to be okay. And those 3 policies, the UNC policy, the Harvard policy, and the Texas policy, considered many factors. They were highly nuanced, they were incredibly sophisticated, and they had strong documentation and data analysis to justify the use of race. And John and I wrote about this in one of the pre-readings called Fisher versus Texas, the limits of exhaustion, where we talked about the sophistication needed to narrowly tailor. So what that means is that if you have that level of sophistication, it's just as easy to design and develop policies that don't use racial classification, but achieve the same effect. So you can use proxies, geography, or race in a general way at the neighborhood level, or at the community level, or at the municipal level to achieve similar effects. And so what are the key strategies? Well, just to summarize the key points, you can use data collection, evaluation, and monitoring. You can do training, education, and other what are called process-based policies. You can use socioeconomic status, income, wealth, or other proxies. You can use geography in the way that I mentioned before with respect to strategic site selection. You can do targeted marketing and outreach. You can use what are called anchor institution strategies, which is where you align the mission of a particular institution, like a zoo or a university or a library, with the needs of the people in the community. None of these policies, none of these strategies entail or require the use of racial classification. So if your goal is to have a reduced racial disparities, you can generally get at that goal through these strategies rather than using race in a specific way. And I'm happy to talk more about that. One of the pre-readings is this article on racial classification, but I'll stop there. Thank you so much for being able to present. And I have some supplementary slides on reparations if you wanted to talk about that in the Q&A, but I'll stop my presentation now. Supplementary slides on reparations if you wanted to talk about that in the Q&A. I'll stop my presentation now.
Thank you, Stephen. John has joined us by phone because he's
We can't
I
hear
am-
you, Judith.
Oh,
Oh, there you
this-
Thank you, Stephen. John
Do I-
has joined us by phone.
no, that's off. That's off.
I haven't heard you somewhere. I think that's it.
Okay.
We can't hear you, Judith.
Oh, good. Okay, sorry. Just John is online. John, if you press *6, you should be able to unmute yourself. He came in via phone so he could answer questions. If you put questions
Can
in
you hear
the
me
chat,
now?
or if anyone has questions in the room, if you don't mind
Yep.
coming up and saying them so everyone can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Just John is online.
Can you hear me now?
*6.
Yes, we can hear you, John.
Unmute yourself. He came in via phone.
So Stephen, one thing I wanted to mention, I'm actually looking for my car, but so situatedness
Anyone has questions in the room, if you don't mind coming up.
properly done does not involve racial classification. So the whole thing around targeted universalism and focusing on situatedness, you avoid racial classification. Hello?
I can hear you, John. I think I caught your main point. I'm not sure if Judith or others heard that.
Yeah, I don't, if anybody, but just, you can just share that with them.
It's,
So
you
that,
can hear me now. It's a little odd delay. Do anyone have questions?
John, I think they're collecting questions at the moment. I'll be sure to make that point if they couldn't hear you.
okay. Okay, thanks. Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you. Judith, do you have any questions? No questions? Any questions in the chat? A lot of folks in the chat. So the questions that Judith, that you had for us were, how do you use a racial lens while defending and advising law enforcement agencies? How do you incorporate equity lens into legal work, and how do you address racial disparities in a race neutral way? I think we've tried to answer the last question directly, which is that you can do it either with the use of racial classifications, in which case you have to have a compelling government interest and has to be narrowly tailored, which can be quite difficult, or you can do it through alternatives, right, that have race conscious policies that don't target race or specify race, but are well designed to reduce racial disparities. And I've mentioned a number of ways you can do that, right? You can do it like the poll tax amendment. You can do it like bail reform. You can do it in other ways, right? Just through sensitivity to the effects on race. There's no truly such thing as a race neutral policy. Every policy either advances racial equity or exacerbates racial disparities. John made the point, since some of you didn't hear it, that the idea of situatedness is really consonant with the idea of not using racial classifications. Because if you look at a person's position with regard to structures, institutions, and in society, the more factors you consider, the more likely the policy is to have the intended effect. And so if you just use one factor, right, race-specific policies generally use one consideration, race. But if you use 5 factors, if you use income, wealth, educational attainment, poverty, or location, you can actually get very close to race in terms of having a positive racial impact or racial equity impact without running afoul of racial classification jurisprudence, of the anti-classification jurisprudence. So that was the main point John was making, is that situatedness is really consistent with using multiple factors to achieve racial equity objectives. Okay, there's a question from the audience, which is, if we didn't have equal protection jurisprudence related to racial classifications, would targeted universalism be structured differently? Would the framework look different? I think it's a great question for John, but let me take the first attempt at answering it. So part of the reason for using targeted universalism is to comply with prevailing jurisprudence. But part of it is actually analytical and communicative. So it's not just about whether a policy can comply with the 14th Amendment or a federal judge's interpretation of the 14th Amendment. It's also about whether a policy is politically sustainable and durable. And research suggests that it's not just that race-targeted and race-specific policies tend to be more likely to be struck down because they entail racial classification. It's that they are politically divisive. And so targeted universalism, by giving everyone a stake in the policy, tend to be more politically durable. And so think about the difference between universal policies versus, say, class-based policies like the war on poverty. The latter tend to be much more politically vulnerable than the former. So universal policies, it's not just about the legal analysis, it's also about the political science analysis about the durability and sustainability of those policies. John, did you want to answer that question as well?
Yeah, so 2 things, Tim. So I completely agree with one other thing, is that that when you get to situatedness and looking at these factors, that's how you're talking about race. So it's not that you're avoiding race, you're actually saying, so what does it mean to be Black American? It means you're less likely to have wealth. It means you like to live in a high concentrated poverty. It means your parents probably didn't go to college. It means you didn't get, so it's like you take all those things and use them to describe the situatedness. Now they're going to be, and that's what Robert Sampson talks about. So there will be other groups that will fit that, but not many, and you get very close. So, but you're exactly right. And of course, I don't think that's a bad thing, because that's really what we're talking about. So anyway, just wanted to mention that.
So I don't know if folks could hear John's answer. I'll summarize his point. What John is saying is that, to a large extent, race is a socio-cultural location. It's a composite of different structural elements. And so if you're not just looking at one element, say income, but you're looking at 4 or 5 elements, you're actually getting close to race anyway. So you can get at race either directly by using race in a targeted way, or you can get at race indirectly, but just as effectively by using multiple factors that are actually more robust in capturing the position that race is meant to specify. I don't know that I more simply conveyed John's comment, but what John is really saying is that in some sense, if you deconstruct race into what its elements are, it's these variables that correlate with race. And so it's not just, in other words, remember how I said that race neutral is a really hazy term, right? In some sense, if you're using these other factors, you're not actually being race neutral. You're actually being race conscious in a very deliberate and intentional way. It's just another route to get at that, objective. Sorry, John, that wasn't the most eloquent and simple way, but I think, did that capture your main point? I can't hear you if you're responding, John. Were there any other questions?
Yes, I did.
Okay, go ahead, John.
Yeah, it did.
Okay, great. There's a question here. Can you clarify, are the factors used in combination and or in alternative either or? So Fisher versus Texas is actually it's a univariate approach. It's a single consideration, not Fisher versus Texas, but rather the Texas 10% plan just looks at class rank. The race conscious approach that was used to supplement the Texas 10% plan is multivariate. It uses like 6 or 7 considerations, of which race is one component. I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but basically what John is suggesting is that multivariate approaches are to be preferred because you're getting closer to an individual or a group's situatedness by looking at multiple factors. And in some ways, race is both over and under inclusive. If you pair race with other factors, you're actually getting at a groups or social groups or subgroups, sociocultural location, structural location more robustly. It's administratively more difficult because you have to have data for multiple factors, but it's actually stronger and it results in a more robust policy and stronger effects. I think that's what you're asking. It's hard to parse that question. Are there any other questions? Okay. Basically, I think what John and I are both suggesting is that whether you're talking about policy, program, actions, or data analysis or training, you can have race-conscious policies that have the desired and intended effects, but as long as you're designing it in a way that does not entail racial classification, you are very likely to survive judicial review. But if you use racial classifications, it's much harder to survive judicial review, and you need to have an extreme level of sophistication to survive narrow tailoring and federal review. And if with that level of sophistication, it's just as easy to design multivariate approaches that can have the same effect, the intended effect. So they're saying thank you. Thank you all. It was an honor to speak with you. If you have any questions, you can email us at my email address is smenending@berkeley.edu. Happy to send you more materials or answer any questions about this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.